On July 21st, 1993, Dr. Avraham Biran, an Israeli archaeologist, discovered a remarkable stone bearing an inscription written in ancient Aramaic. He had found the first reference outside the Bible to King David and a ruling dynasty, evidence of the house of David.
Raise up a king, one of your own. Call him to lead us, establish his throne. I have chosen a shepherd after my heart, King of my people, my anointed one.
Shalom, hello again. Welcome back to our House of David series. We've been talking about the life of King David from David's Tower here in Jerusalem. And we've looked at David from his days as a young shepherd boy in Bethlehem, when he served in the court of King Saul as an armor bearer and musician, and as a warrior when he faced Goliath and saved Israel, defeating the giant. That actually led to a problem. Saul became jealous of young David. Of David, it was said Saul had killed 1,000, but David has killed 10,000. It was exaggerated, his skill as a warrior, and the king became jealous. Jonathan, David's friend, pleaded against Saul's jealousy and said, "Why would you shed innocent blood? David hasn't done anything." But Saul began to pursue the former champion of the nation. We're going to go now to a location where Steve Gear tells the story of Nabal and Abigail. We'll go to Ein Gedi.
We're here in the majestic wilderness that is the area of Ein Gedi, high up on the rocky mountains, the crags that the Old Testament speaks so eloquently of. The area where David escaped from Saul, the king who sought his life. After the events that happened in the cave where David spared the life of Saul, David went down from these mountains, from these rocky crags where he had been living, and went to the area below. Below was a wealthy landowner by the name of Nabal. This is found in 1 Samuel chapter 25. Now, Nabal in Hebrew means fool, and this is exactly the way the Old Testament account portrays Nabal. Now, David went down with his men. By that time, he had 600 men with him, outlaws all, and they went down to the wealthy landowner Nabal, and they surrounded his property. They protected his sheep and his land and his servants from all the other outlaws in the area, all the other marauding tribes, the Philistines, etc. And at the end of a certain period of time that David protected Nabal and his property, he went to Nabal and said, "Please, give me and my men provisions enough so that we may live in peace and in contentment for a while for the service that we have done for you in protecting you." Nabal sent word to David and his men saying, "Who is David, son of Jesse? There are many slaves running away from their masters these days, aren't they? Who are you to me, and why should I give you of my plenty?" And when David heard this, he got angry. He got upset, and he called his men together, and he said, "May I be cursed if I don't slaughter Nabal and all his people with him this day for the injustice that he has done against me." As David was on his way to attack Nabal and his people, Nabal's wife, Nabal the fool, had a wife, Abigail, and she ran out to meet David along the way. She ran out with provisions and food and drink, enough to last many, many, many weeks. She got off her animal. She bowed down low to David, and she said, "Please, son of Jesse, stay your hand. Do not do the evil that you contemplate this day against my husband. He is a Nabal. He is a fool. It's just what his name is. And he knows not what he's doing." David heard what Abigail had said, and he realized that she was right. He stayed his hand and that of the hands of his 600 outlaws that day. Now Nabal had a party that week, and he got very drunk and very merry. And when Abigail came to the party and told him what she had done, he became very upset. And the Bible says he became like a stone and fell down. 10 days later, he had died. What this passage illustrates is that no one can defraud or defame the Lord's anointed without the hand of God, Adonai, coming down and smiting. Now I can imagine being up here as David had returned with his men to the strongholds that are Ein Gedi, that he sat up here contemplating what God had done in his life up to that point. Perhaps he sat up here in this very spot, composed a psalm to the great God of Israel.
It is really beautiful at Ein Gedi. Here in the middle of this arid, harsh landscape is an oasis filled with lush vegetation and cascading waterfalls. This was an ideal hiding place for David and his men. Steve tells us more.
Let's see how the concept of the Lord's anointed and striking out against the Lord's anointed is illustrated further in the account of David's life. Now, after the events of Nabal and David came back to the wilderness area, he learned once again that Saul would come out to kill him. And Saul camped in the area where David and his men were hiding. But Saul did not yet learn the location of David. So one evening, while Saul and his men were camped out and asleep, and David said, "Which of you will come down with me to Saul's camp?" And so his nephew, Abishai, said, "I will," and the two of them snuck down to the camp where Saul and his men were sleeping. And David and Abishai stood over Saul as he slept helpless. And Abishai said, "Look, here's Saul's spear. Look, David, all I need to do is just take the spear, and one shot, Saul is dead. Boom! I don't need to strike him twice." But David once again, just as he had said in the cave where he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe, he said, "Abishai, stay your hand, far be it from us to harm the Lord's anointed. But so that he knows that we once again, for the second time, had the opportunity to smite him, let's take his spear. And furthermore, let's take his water jug." And that's what they did. They took his spear, his water jug, and they snuck out of the camp, and they went back up into these mountains. Now the next day, David went over to the far side of the hill and looked down upon Saul and his men. And he left a great space so that Saul had no opportunity to have his men throw spears or shoot arrows at him. But he cried out to the people, "Where is the king's spear, by the way? And where is his water jug?" And Saul looked, and they saw that the spear and the water jug were missing, and that David had once again had the opportunity to come and kill Saul. And so Saul looked up and he cried out, Art thou David, my son? David, of course, was Saul's son-in-law. He was indeed his son. David answered, It is my voice, O king. And he said, Wherefore does my Lord pursue his servant? For what have I done? Judge for yourself whether the path that you choose and the course that you pursue is the righteous one in the eyes of the Lord. And then Saul answered David and said, I have indeed sinned. Return, my son David, for I will do thee no more harm. Because my soul was precious in your sight last night. I have played the fool. I, Saul, have played the Nabal and have made a large mistake. And David answered, Here's your spear. Send someone to fetch it. May the Lord render to every man his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord delivered thee into my hand this day. But I would not stretch forth my hand against the Lord's anointed. Then Saul said to David, May you be blessed, my son. You will do great things, and you will still prevail. Saul admitted to David that day that he would one day sit on Saul's throne. It would not be Saul's blood children that would inherit the kingly line, but it was David, his son-in-law, who would inherit the mantle of the Mashiach, of the Lord's anointed.
David always had problems with King Saul. He continued to honor Saul even while the king hunted him and persecuted him. But David had already been anointed king. God was obviously with him. A modern-day parallel is evangelist Jacob Damkani, a persecuted person who confronts modern-day Sauls all the time when we return.
The opposition, for the most part, will be a rejection through words. That is really, if you don't really know how to take it to the Lord, you can be devastated.
The land of Israel, Israel my love, is like no other land in the world. We're bound for the promised land. We're going back to Israel. And the people who have joined us on past tours say it's an experience they will treasure for the rest of their days.
I think every Christian needs to come here and just sense the same things that I guess all of them that have felt going before us, because we've heard it said that your whole life will be changed if you come to the Holy Land and you can relate more to where Jesus was in the temple and all the great and mighty things that he did.
This is my second tour with Zola. The first one was in June of 1984, and it was a beautiful tour. It was so lovely, and I love Israel so much I had to come back and see it again and live it again.
Come with us to Israel and walk where Jesus walked. Let us break bread together in Jerusalem. Whether it is on the streets of Jerusalem or the beaches of Tel Aviv, Jacob Damkani has been boldly proclaiming Jesus is our Messiah to his fellow Jews for several years now. Our producer, Ken Berg, found out what has been going on in the life of this promised land evangelist.
I left Israel in 1974 for travel around the world, ended up in New Jersey. And in 1977, a man walked into my shop and began witnessing to me as I had my Old Testament on my desk. And there I had my first encounter with Jesus. And through the Old Testament, I was pushed to search the matter. And God, by his grace, his mercy, have revealed to me that Jesus indeed is the promised one.
I think we last talked to you about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Can you
Right.
bring us up to date with what's happened with your ministry since then?
Oh, well, much been done since there. Many seed been sown, many tract been passed. The Lord blessed me with writing a book, and it's called Why Me? My life story that really expand on the Old Testament prophecies, and
Written in Hebrew?
written in Hebrew, and hoping that God in due time will bring it into English, believing that indeed there is a message there, not only for the Israelis and for the Jewish people, but indeed for the Christian world to really understand that Jesus didn't come to bring a new religion to the world. And I think there is indeed a message.
And how do you use this book?
I use it as I pass it out in army camps. I already saw people coming to faith finding this book in the libraries of army camps. Use it in the jails and of course in the streets as we give it to people who show interest in the matter. And so we give them the book free of charge, usually alongside with the New Testament.
Is witnessing difficult here in Israel compared to the United States?
Well, what does the Bible tell us? In the book of Timothy, it says that those who seek to live in righteousness will be persecuted. And so I really believe no matter where you are, if you really stand for Christ, there is a form of opposition of some sort. And in Israel, it shows in different maybe than it does in the United States. But even in the USA, you'll have people that will make fun of you and reject you, and therefore you have people that will really keep it for themselves. But here, you will have the opposition in different ways. I would say that it's not as hard to witness in Israel as most people think. There are people who take in the law into their own hands, and that's the people that really will cause riots and troubles in the streets. It doesn't happen as often as it used to be back then when you met me 7 years ago. The nation's beginning to get used to this thing. And yeah, most people really are interested to really hear the good news.
Yaakov and his congregation use this house as a base to witness from. Recently, they have been responding to one of the problems in Israel today, reaching out to drug addicts.
Drug addicts have really arrived into the dungeons, into the gutters, have really, for the most part, it came to the end of themselves. And I have great hope for these people, believing that it is those kind of people that really came to David, people who came to the end of the rope, the 400 in Hebrew, pochazim. I forgot the words for it in English, but 400 pochazim that really follow David is those kind of people. As I really, my heart desire is to really build a strong army of evangelists, missionaries, Israelis. I see those kind of people that when they come to faith, they fear nothing.
On that subject of David, since you've raised his name, we're in the middle of a series on David. In part, we're touching upon the covenant that God made with David. Is it still good today?
Well, it is an everlasting covenant, and I think all Christians should know that the covenant made with Abraham as well, Isaac and Jacob, as well as with David, is everlasting, a bit different than the covenant he made with Moses. But this covenant is indeed an everlasting covenant. And I would say this, if God doesn't have someone sitting on a throne of David to be a king and rule over Israel, as he promised he would to David, then the whole Bible is a phony one, it's a joke. But indeed he does.
What do you say to the person who says the church has replaced Israel, though?
If you can't really trust God and his everlasting covenant that he made with Israel, where can you have a hope? Where can you have a hope? Your hope will be in vanity. If he breaks his covenant with Israel, then you have no reason to trust him to keep his covenant with you and give you everlasting life.
You're speaking of the covenant with Abraham?
That's everlasting covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm speaking about the covenant with David, and I'm speaking about the new covenant that he have promised to the house of Israel and to the house of Judah in Jeremiah chapter 31. This should be very clear that the new covenant didn't come out of the blue. It was promised to Israel, and therefore those who come in faith through the new covenant are partakers of the promises given to Israel.
Jacob, do you think we're living in a period that the Bible refers to as the end of the age?
Most certainly.
In what way?
There is, I would say, 4 signs that can really let us know that we're living at this time, the end of the age. The one is the fact that Israel have came back to their homeland. That is not to have just another nation on the map. The fact that he opened the doors in Russia, USSR, to bring the Jews out. That's described in the book of Ezekiel. On top of it, for the first time, you see Jews coming to faith in Israel, in the Messiah Yeshua. That is something the church should absolutely take a note of. Since the time of Acts, we didn't have such a move upon Jews to see Jesus for who he really is. And then the fourth thing that is very interesting is this whole peace talk and this whole matter with Jerusalem. As I see it, God is setting up the stage and the platform for the day of the Lord. And that is very clear in the book of Zechariah.
Is there a particular passage you're referring to?
Zechariah chapter 12. And it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the people. All who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. Israel may give up Judea and Samaria. Israel, God forbid, may give back the Golan Heights. But when the issue of Jerusalem will rise, that's when the problem going to start. Israel will not give up on Jerusalem.
Do you think that the typical American really understands what's happening over here in Israel?
This is a spiritual battle between the kingdom of God and kingdom of Satan. And most people are really naive in their hope for peace, because they're not aware of what spirit is driving those forces, be it the Islam on one hand, and be it the humanistic on the other hand, Israel, a humanistic society who hope for things, who are really naive, and who have not come to the real lesson of our history through the Bible.
Jacob, anything else you'd like to say?
I'd like to say thank you for all the believers in the United States, for those who stand with the trumpet of salvation to Israel, and those who know me and pray for the work of evangelism here in the land. Appreciate very much those who support the work of the trumpet of salvation, and to God be the glory.
Whisper softly to me your gentle words of hope, mercy and love without end. Help me hear heaven's voice, feel the warmth and embrace of God, my comfort and friend, my comfort and friend.
The dancer that you saw during the music video was a Jewish believer who comes from Jerusalem and is a member, therefore, of the Mother Church. You know, I've said that, and occasionally I get letters, no, the real church is American and so on. No, the real church started in Jerusalem, and it's always met there, by the way. It's never stopped. There have always been Jewish believers, a remnant, and Gentile believers in Jerusalem, holding Christian services straight on since Pentecost. I have told the story before of how I went to an apartment, had a chicken dinner, listened to testimonies and hymns and a teacher and so on, and it seemed like a social evening, but the host informed me I'd been to church, and I had. He said, this church has been meeting every Sabbath since Pentecost, only the members have changed, and that's right. But they get a certain amount of persecution. The believers are persecuted in Israel. Well, they're persecuted in a lot of countries, and in some ways they ought to be here. They ought to make enough noise to be persecuted. You know, a missionary once told me, I said, you have a very tough mission field. It was the Middle East also, but among the Arabs and Bedouins in the Sinai. And boy, he taught me a lesson. He said, persecution is the proper exercise of the church. If it doesn't get enough, it gets weak and flabby. And the Jerusalem church is fit, let me put it that way. Jacob especially, who is threatened regularly and really had to finally back off from Jerusalem itself because it's just full of Orthodox Jewish people, and they just bother him. I remember I asked him once, how did you do this week? And he said, I had a great week. They burned my bag, but nobody hit me. The ones that hit him call themselves the pious ones in Hebrew. And this is a self-styled religiosity of the ultra-Orthodox. And they're not pious in my Bible. This is not the Koran. This is not a Bible that says to go and kill your enemies and punish them. And not at all. It says love your neighbor. It says pray for them that despitefully use you. It says restore thy neighbor's ox and so on. They're not pious other than in their own minds. Persecution, though, is normal. I'm afraid so. The Lord said, when men revile you and persecute you in my name's sake, and so on, right on the Sermon on the Mount. Our offer is the House of David videos. Now they're getting ready, and it's time to order. You can order Part 1. This is such a long series that Part 1, 8 programs, can be ordered now, $79. We'll tell you about Part 2 later. So please put Part 1, House of David, $79. And the Faith in the Fire cassette. Marty Goetz is the singer. He's a wonderful Messianic singer, and I want you to hear the way he does these songs. Of course, you're hearing parts of them on the program. That's $12. So the videos for $79, the music cassette for $12, and Sha'alu, Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
Raise up